All right, our second speaker is Charles Tresser from IBM. He will be speaking about the manifold structure of physics versus the emergence and decay of geometry in physics.
Yeah, in fact, probably since I have only half an hour, I'm going to speak about only one of these two aspects. I spoke already about that in Rio recently. Something I never do. I mean, I hate to repeat the talks. It's not because of the content, but because in case somebody was there already, I cannot repeat the jokes, so I have to, that's the terrible part of it. No, I really wanted to speak about that because probably my main contribution to the collection of science and mathematics has been so far question rather than answer. And this, I think, is the main kind of area of question that I ever raised. So with such a distinguished audience, I want to present Denis with what is probably the main questions that I have raised. And since the last question I contributed to raise cost him 8 years in his life, I hope that he will come with an answer in the next 20 years. So it might give me again the opportunity to see him on a very regular basis. So, as I said, so I cannot use any of the jokes that I had, but so I have to tell you a true story. When I was in Arizona a long time ago, at the beginning of my stay in America, a famous mathematician came to visit me at home with his kid and the mother of his kid, and they spent some time in our family. And at that time, my mother-in-law was there, and she found this man very attractive, seductive, and very, polite, and, she's very old, but, she really appreciated that guy. But each time we were in the car together with my kids and my mother-in-law, she would ask me regularly, "Tell me, Charlie, what was the name of this elegant man who was so eager to do mathematics with you that he was banging at the door when you were in the bathroom to ask you questions about mathematics?" And then all my kids who loved that guy were yelling together, "Denis Sullivan, mommy!" Okay. Yeah. So when I began to look at relativity when I was about that high, I began to have a problem with the fact that you need to have local time and local space, and it seemed to me that this concept do not make sense. I mean, how do you measure? I mean, as a physicist, you need tools to measure anything, and you cannot measure time if you don't have a tool which has some extent. So what is if you build a clock, your clock, that's a clock. What is the time which is indicated? The time here, the time here, there's really a problem. And when I began to do science a bit seriously with my friend.
I don't get it.
What?
I don't get the problem.
Oh, it's not that the problem. Yeah, I'm going to say, what, the problem here?
Yeah.
Where? I mean, if there is a local time, you need some tool which is local to measure it. So these 2 points are not the same points, so they should have different times. Or are you going to put a clock here and a clock here? What is the minimal size of a clock? I mean, it's big. If you want to be able to use it to do all the things that Einstein described when he tells you about relativity, these are big objects. And same thing, if you want to have something to measure space, in fact, that's something I realized later, but it's all the question of measurement of space-time which are not there. So I tried to convince my friend Pierre Coulet to work on this type of issue. He said it was not very interesting. And I came back to this problem much later, and in a completely different context. The one of these new trends of quantum information theory, quantum cryptography. I discussed with one of the masters of the subject, another IBMer called Charles Bennett. He told me, look, there are two types of information. The classical information and the quantum information. The classical information travels at most at the speed of light, of course. But the quantum information can travel instantly. I said, wow, I want to study such a thing. I mean, it seems so amazing, so fantastic. So problem is that you don't do what you want when you're employed by a huge company like this. So getting into a new field and doing all that was a bit difficult. But it happened something in my life. I became very ill, and then I began to be paid not to work but to suffer, to have pain. And once you are paid to have pain, then you can do what you want for your time. So I spent several years of my life getting into that field, and realized that most of what people were saying about the main question related to that was bullshit. I mean, it's to an amazing extent. I mean, people are lying, people are misciting, people copy from others the reference without going to look at what's going on. It's a catastrophe. And I thought that this was really bad, I couldn't find any example of that in my new field, I mean, mathematics. And I was really upset with that. So and it's only, in fact, very recently that I learned that some practices of this time have been taking place in mathematics recently, and this, I think, is also really a big concern. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to speak about the story about physics. So what I began to realize is that probably there is no space-time at small scale, at small enough scale, for reasons which are much deeper, I mean, much more precise and technical than this initial intuition. But when I told that to one of the guys who co-invented the black holes, I mean the name at least, what's his name? Remo Ruffini in Nice, he told me, Riemann already suggested that maybe at small scale there is no space-time geometry, that everything falls down when you go small enough. And in fact, I know, thanks to Wellington de Mello, who learned it from Mauricio Peixoto, that Napoleon already had intuition about the fact that physics had serious problems at small scale, and to the extent that he wanted to be a physicist before he decided to become military and become who you know. I mean, this is published in the memoir of the Marquis de Saint-Hilaire. So, reference given by Mauricio Peixoto. So, when I came back to New York with such an information, knowing that even Riemann thought the same thing, that I arrived to the same possible conclusion I arrived to, I called my sensei, Denis. I mean, each time there is something important, I try to get in touch with him. So I told him, Denis, I have learned something fantastic. Riemann wrote in his habilitation that perhaps there is no physics at very small scale, and I arrived at the same conclusion, and I began to establish all the theory about that. And he told me, I read this text once a year, and this is the portion of the text written by Riemann, which is extracted from a translation that has been given to us as part of the second volume of the book of Spivak on differential geometry. It's very difficult to find. I think that's the only English translation of this text, which is very precious. So that's one more reason why this book is very useful. What I did, in fact, about that is I really think that I worked a bit the way Denis told me, trying to get proofs, and once you have a proof, try to understand what you have proven. And with this dynamic of the way of doing stuff, I convinced, in fact, one of Denis' former students, Edson de Faria, who unfortunately is sick and could not come here, but he sends his best regards to Denis, of course. An essential part of the discussion is joint work with Edson. And what we did is that, in fact, eventually we isolated a completely new concept, which allows us to do things better. But first, I need a little bit of introduction to the subject. So you all know, I think, that when you're in quantum mechanics, you have a problem with simultaneous measurement of conjugate variables. For instance, if you take the space and time, you look at the uncertainty on x and on the position and on momentum, and this is at least h bar over 2. And this is already an indication of the fact that this might seem to some an indication. I don't need this text anymore. Yeah. Maybe we can even go up. So this is already an indication of the fact that there is not serious geometry. But there is a problem here. I mean, you can say that this is only here because you do measurement. Maybe it's because we do measurement that we have this problem. So maybe if we would go to the actual value of the position of the momentum before we disturb them by measurement, we would have nothing like that, and we would have a proper geometry where space and time are momentum, space, time, all that is well defined. Because you have also similar stuff if you look at the precision of time at which you make a measurement and the precision of space. I mean, all the things which are related to the geometric structure of space-time come in pair like this, where you have this type of relation. So it could be a priori that it is, so that my algorithm is a non-noisy stuff. Yeah. Okay. So it could be that it is only the measurement which causes a problem. But what I'm going to show you is that it's not the case. But I'm going to, there are several ways to approach the problem, and I think that the way we do it now with Edson is much better than anything which was done before. So I'm not 70, but I'm 60, so I need my glasses. So, so I'm going to give you a definition, but before that, I'm going to motivate something. So if you have particles which have spin 1/2, so you don't need to know what is a spin 1/2. The only thing you need to know is that when you take a particle like this and you put it in a magnet, assuming the particle is neutral, you put it in a magnet with some direction, with angle, some angle, alpha with horizon, which is, say, unit vector A. And then you go to another magnet with unit vector B, and you take the normalized projection, you get either -1 or +1. In fact, it's -1/2 or +1/2. So the only thing you get from the normalization is that you get rid of a factor 2. Okay? So like this, each time you go through a magnet like this, you get a sign +1 or -1. So now we have, stories about sequence of signs of +1 or -1. So now there is a law which is called Malus law that some people might know in the context of optics, but I'm going to give it to you in the context of spin 1/2 particle. So the law is that the correlation between the sequence, so if you call ui the sequence of -1 and 1 coming here, and xi the sequence coming here, what you get is that the scalar product u1 xi is equal to the scalar product of these two vectors. Okay? Well, for later use, let me call that one alpha. In fact, this one, the first one says that the particle is prepared, and then on the second, it's measured. So, I mean, if you want to give really nitty-gritty details, the particle goes up if it has a plus and goes down otherwise. So you need, in fact, two instruments, but that's the same story. I mean, there is still a single sequence ordered by given which correspond to the index. Okay, so now motivated by this fact, which is very well known, we gave a new definition. We said that a sequence of particles pi, say I belong to to I, where I is a big set, but well, you can take it as n or a finite set. But then, of course, if it's not infinite, where you get a scalar product, you get something which is close to a scalar product. So you say that this sequence is A-prepared if there exists a sequence UI belonging to -1, 1 to the I, such that for every alpha, if one measures the particles along alpha, then one gets a sequence xi such that the scalar product of the sequence ui and xi is equal to a alpha, so the scalar product of a and alpha. Okay? What? No. Yeah, that's all. Well, these are sequences. This is u equal sequence u equal. Okay, and x that's sequence. So you get the sequence x. So you take the scalar product. You say the average, the limit of the average of the product of the ui xi. That's limit of 1 over n sum of ei of equal 1 to n of xi times ui times xi. But instead of the limit, you can take a very long stuff, and it's approximatively.
There are 4 little letters there, and I'm having trouble. I've got to arrange a lot of logic. So the sequence is A-prepared. If there exists another sequence.
That's a sequence of particles. You say it's A-prepared. If there is a sequence, it's an abstract version of what you get here. This is the way to A-prepared.
I tried to put it in my head. It's 4 things. You have to put 4 things in your head. It's not easy at this stage. There's a sequence. So it's A-prepared with the sequence. U, for every alpha, measures the particle alpha, measures the particles along alpha, then one gets.
The square product is the correlation of these two sequences is the scalar product.
It's too complicated.
What you get here is that. Here you get the sequence UI.
4 things.
Yeah, but here they are here. Here you have the sequence along this vector. Second vector, you have the second sequence, xi. Okay? If you do the correlation of ui and xi, this is a alpha. Okay? But that's a natural thing which happened in an experiment. So now I abstract that and I say that this sequence, the sequence of particles, is A-prepared if there exists some sequence such that for every alpha I get this property. And then I only do the measurement here. I did not tell you how UI is gotten. Anyway, you get UI so that you have that, you say that the sequence is A-prepared. Because when you compare it to another angle, whichever other the direction you project, you get this scalar product.
Can you paraphrase it in a way that's understandable?
Marco, can you help me? You understood it. You understand this setting here. These particles, they come, they give a first sequence, a second sequence, and if I do the scalar product, I get that. The correlation, I get that, yeah. Okay? That's okay?
It's okay, I mean, I just don't get it. My brain won't take it in.
Okay, you just send particle after particle. For each of them, you get two signs, which are whether you go up or down along two directions.
There are four things. How many are fixed and how many are varying?
Okay, so in this case, a priori, nothing, you fix A and alpha, arbitrary.
Fix A and alpha arbitrary.
Okay? And then for every pair A and alpha, experimentally or theoretically, you have the same conclusion. The correlation is equal to the scalar product. That's a fact. Okay? Now, I extract from there with the Edson.
Wait, you're fixing A and alpha.
Yeah.
But they're arbitrary, fixed arbitrary.
Yeah, and for each of them, I get always a scalar product. Okay?
For each of what?
For each of the pair A alpha, when I do this type of experiment, I get the scalar product A alpha.
Okay, what's the experiment?
I send a particle, I look if it's deviated up or down. That here we get a +1, here -1, and here I see if the particle goes this way or that way. This will be a +1, this is a -1. I collect like this as two sequences of +1s and -1s. One here, one here.
Yeah,
and then I look at the correlation. The correlation is equal to the scalar product of the two vectors.
You get the correlation of what?
Of these two sequences. For instance, if alpha would be along A, each time I go up, I would go up, and the correlation would be 1. If I would look at a 90-degree angle, there would be no correlation. This correlation would be 0. If I would take the vector on the other side, it would be -1. Okay? So now, abstract concept.
This guy is nodding his head, so can you say what it is? You. Can you say?
Because the sum of +1 -1 is always +1 -1 of 0.
Basically, A and alpha are just two vectors, and you measure like particle has the same direction or the opposite direction, and then it turns out that you get some sequence of plus and minus ones each time, and that some sequences occur more often than the others. For example, if A and alpha are orthogonal, then we just get always opposite signs, and this means that we will get 0.
No, you gave the formula for optics. If they are orthogonal, they are uncorrelated with 0. And if it's opposite, because for optics, you take half of the angle and then you work on the projective space, while here you're on the circle because you are looking at spins. Okay, so you have this concept. So now the question is, can a sequence be both A prepared and B prepared? Which means there are two sequences here, one UI and a sequence VI, and the correlation for O alpha and the sequence XI, which correspond to this alpha, I would have both UI XI equal A alpha and VI XI equal B alpha. Is that possible? And the answer is that there are open sets, so these these vectors can be parameterized by points in S2. So there is a maximal open set. There exists a maximal open set W in S2 cross S2, such that for some alpha, you cannot get this type. You get contradictions. Okay. That's a little lemma. So now, I can prove it, but it's, you know, it's a little computation, so it's not very interesting to you, I guess, to have 5 lines of computation. But you can prove that very easy lemma without any assumption other than what I've made. And now comes the main question. I've told you initially that, you know, the issue here about whether or not there is lack of geometry behind that depends on the fact that perhaps the only perturbation you make is because you make measurement, and perhaps the true coordinates exist, make sense, and satisfy something much better than that. That's what people in the school of some physicists like Bohm, De Broglie, a few others believe. Okay? So now, here are two standard hypotheses that one can make. I can assume realism. And more precisely, I will take the weakest possible sense of meaning for realism. I will assume that if at some point I make a measurement of a quantity on a particle, then any other quantity associated to this particle and that I do not measure has a value which makes sense, which is this kind of unperturbed value, okay? Okay, so that if there would be realism, then this would mean that this does not destroy geometry. But I want to show that realism is false. That although I think that the moon is there even when I don't look at it, when you come to the world of tiny particles at the quantum scale, there is no realism. Okay? So that's the first hypothesis, standard. And then there is another hypothesis which is standard, which is called locality. And one makes this type of typically this type of hypothesis in the following context, typically. Okay, so here is the context. You create pairs of particles, say p prime. One goes to the left, one goes to the right, such that you know they are perfectly anti-correlated. So if one has a spin up, the other one has a spin down, and along any direction in particular. Okay, and then you can make a measurement here, and you can make a measurement here, and then locality means that the value of the spin that you look at here is independent of the orientation of this other apparatus if the two events, the two measurements are spatially separated. So delta x square greater than c square delta t square, where this is a difference in time, say in the observatory frame, the difference in time between the two measurements, and this is the distance between the 2 points where you measure. Okay, so if you have that the value here is independent of the position of the apparatus here, then you say that you have locality. And typically, people like Penrose think that there is no locality at the quantum level. There is no locality, and a great majority now of physicists in some fields, subfields of physics, think that there is no locality. And the reason why they think that is because of the statement I'm going to make. The proof that we give with Edson is new, and to my opinion, it proves also that the old proof is wrong, because we have you know, it's conceptually very different. But the fact here is that if you assume these two stuff together, then this implies that so if measurements, if So let me tell it in another way. This implies that one, at least, of the particle, the sequence of particle pi and p prime I said p and p prime, but that's at each stage. So you have a sequence of such events. Yeah. So if one at least of these two sequence of particle is both A prepared, where A is actual, so it means that you use really this vector to make projection on this side, and B prepared, where B uses realism. So you assume that, so for this B, you know from quantum mechanics that you cannot measure the two stuff at the same time, okay? So this one you get directly by measuring, and then you say, okay, by realism, that by the form of realism that I have used, that I have defined before, the fact that I measure along A gives me that along B there is some value. I don't know what it is, but it exists. Okay? So what you get here, if you put that together with a statement I made before, which is, here is a statement, no, that's the answer. I asked the question here, can a particle be A and B prepared? The answer is no, it cannot be in general, okay? While this setting and this classical hypothesis implies that you can. So you reach directly a contradiction. The usual proof continue for a bit longer. You do some more manipulation. But this one, at this stage, you know already that you have hit a contradiction. And the fact is that instead of locality, you can use a much weaker hypothesis. It's a bit of work to prove that it's weaker, but it is weaker. And this other hypothesis, that's something I spent several years upon. And to tell you how good this hypothesis is, very often I got my papers about that rejected in less than 24 hours. So here is a hypothesis. It's called effect after cause principle. And what does it tell you? I prefer to read it because it's I want to have it right. Shit. Okay, the effect particle, it tells you that for any Lorentz, it's not this one, it's this one, not the one from observer, the value of an observable cannot change from any cause or because of any cause that happens after said observable has been measured for that observer. Oh, I have to give you a crash course on relativity. Very easy. Everything is relative. Half an hour when you are seated there and half an hour when you speak is a completely different story. So So now I come back to quantum mechanics. So that's the effect after cause principle. If you look at it carefully, you can see that this, if you restrict it to the things which are effectively measured, is nothing but causality. So it's absolutely, everybody would agree with that. But it has to cover also the variables which come from realism. These are not covered by causality because probably they do not exist. So I need a principle which says that, the same thing happens for these other variables that cannot change after I've made observation related to them. Okay? So if you make this hypothesis and realism, so you replace locality by this much weaker statement, although it's not completely trivial to prove that it's much weaker, but it is much weaker. Then you get to the same conclusion, that in this situation, you get particles which are both A and B prepared for any pair A and B that you want, contradicting the theorem that we have proved on this new abstract basis with Edson. So this tells you that, this story, you cannot escape this fact. I mean, either you measure the conjugate variable and you have the uncertainty relation, or they do not have meaning. So if they do not have meaning, of course, you don't have geometry. This comes on top of this simple intuition, which is that you don't have tools anyway at this scale. And if you don't have tools at this scale, if you believe that physics is an experimental science, then you cannot do physics at this scale. So the other part of my title was about the fact that Plato had this view of the world of knowledge being a sphere. I think that what we know now about physics and mathematics, it would be about time to reorganize the way we think about the set of physics theories as a manifold which is much more complicated. And it would be interesting to study, for instance, the algebraic topology of this manifold of theory of physics. And you might be surprised to learn from that there are different tangent space which are the theories that we can express, which are tangent to the space of actual law of nature that we cannot access. And there is very certainly a very nice theory to be developed here, which will represent the way both our knowledge and the optimal knowledge. And from there, we might learn stuff and discover why there are things that we cannot understand. I'm done, I guess. Rio, I say that if I cannot help finding what replaces geometry, then I will do something simpler, like trying to prove the Riemann hypothesis.
Do you have a quick question?
Can you make a comment?
Sure.
Can I make a comment about this formula, the Heisenberg formula?
Yeah.
Really from a point of view of a guy who knows no physics.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so you start, the physics will say that you will represent the position, the density of position by psi of x squared, and represent the probability of an impulsion by psi hat of p squared.
Yeah.
So that's physics.
Yeah.
When you have said that, this is just an integration by parts.
Yeah.
Which means that the issue is rather whether you can represent the world by wave.
Yeah, but this is at the same time a very deep story in physics and a triviality in mathematics. Yeah.
But what is not the triviality is to use that for physics.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the fact is that initially there were some Gedanken experiments which were proposed by Heisenberg to support this formula, and now this formula has been checked experimentally. There is a guy in Austria who is a defender, unfortunately, but less and less of locality, of non-locality. Sorry, but less and less. But his other specialty, maybe above other things, is that he makes experiments about all the things for which there were only Gedanken experiments so far. So, and this one in particular is covered by, is also supported by direct experimental evidence.
Very appropriate talk for the center in which we are. Let's thank our speaker again.